With 360 video and 360 photos, if the stitching is poor then your shots won't look as effective because the images from the two lenses won't line up properly and they won't blend into one smooth image. So how does the stitching compare between the Insta360 ONE R, the Insta360 ONE X and the GoPro Max? In this video I'm going to compare the stitching between the three cameras in three different areas. So 1, walking along the stitch line itself, 2, when the camera is mounted close to an object or when we bring our hands close to the camera, and 3, when it's mounted on a selfie stick. So let's get straight to it. Stitching problems obviously show up around the stitching area and the stitching line of the camera. So usually we would just avoid this area and avoid putting our main point of focus on the stitching line. So let's start by breaking that rule and walking along the stitching line to see how the different cameras compare. From 2 meters away from the camera, as you'd expect, there's not a lot of difference in the stitching, and even up as close as ½ meter away from the camera, all three cameras are still stitched nicely together, but all three images at this point do look very different. The most natural stitch at this distance I think is actually the Max, which I found surprising, followed by the ONE X and then followed by the ONE R. The ONE R has stitched everything together well in that everything joins up properly, but in order to do that I think that I look a little bit squashed in the image. If you look at the penguin on my t-shirt you'll see what I mean, it's a little narrower than on the other two cameras. Now let's disturb the stitch line even more by moving my hands really close to the camera to see how the stitching algorithm copes. In this test the clear winner as expected is the ONE X, making an almost perfect stitch of the hands even when they're really close to the camera. The ONE R comes in second and holds up quite well throughout most of the movement. The worst stitching is the GoPro Max because it seems to be completely out of alignment in this shot more often than the other cameras, and at points it literally just cuts my fingers to half their length. The stitching for most 360 cameras is most challenging at the base of the camera called the nadir, where we fix the selfie stick or we fix the tripod or we stick the camera onto a mount. In these situations there's very little distance between the base of the camera and the surface that it's mounted onto, so the stitching software has to work really hard to blend the images together. Whenever possible you'd move the camera away from the point of contact and from the surface with an extension arm or a selfie stick, which will help improve the stitch line, but it's not always possible. So how do these three cameras compare when we look at this area in close-up? If we put the cameras on this mosaic table we can see straight away how well they've coped with stitching the pattern together. The ONE X creates a slight elliptical shape from the original round circle in the middle of the shot, but overall the stitching is excellent and maintains the mosaic pattern perfectly. The ONE R has squashed the circle more but has done a fairly good job around the base of the camera, and then as you move out away from the camera you can see the misalignment with the squares and the slight blurring of the stitch line, but overall it's done a pretty good job. The Max again is the worst, with a totally misaligned inner circle that doesn't even come close and doesn't start to align the stitch until much further out from the base of the camera. If we now put the cameras on a handlebar mount we can see how this close-up stitching will affect your shot in a more realistic scenario. It's probably no surprise that the ONE X is a clear winner by a mile, and apart from shaving a bit of width off the handlebar, everything looks normal, intact and aligned. It's probably a tie between the Max and the ONE R, and you could probably tweak the camera position to gain a bit more hand with the ONE R to match the Max. But the ONE R and the Max both give you distorted hands and a poor stitch line that impairs the shot. If I had to choose between the two I'd probably go with the slightly distorted hand of the Max rather than the completely cut off hand in the ONE R. So for the last comparison, how does the stitching line compare when we look at the invisible selfie stick floating camera style shots that we all love? The floating camera style shot was the #1 selling point of the ONE X when it came out, and if you look at the results of these shots then you can see why. With the ONE X the stitching around the hand is seamless. My hand isn't distorted, and yes, I'm clearly holding something, but all you can see is a small black mark in my hand. And my hand looks pretty normal, and the floating camera is still pretty magical. With the ONE R and the Max you still have the same floating effect, but your attention is drawn more to the hand, because with the ONE R my hand has been cut off in the stitch line, and with the Max my hand has been split into two and is just misaligned. If we extend the selfie stick and take it higher we do draw less attention to the distortion, but the ONE X is still the most natural looking shot from a stitching point of view. As far as the best stitching is concerned out of all three cameras, I think it's very clear that the Insta360 ONE X is the winner. And of course this is mainly due to its slim body design and the fact that the lenses are much closer together, which makes it a much easier job for the stitching algorithm in most situations. My personal opinion on second place does go to the Insta360 ONE R, but it does get a little bit subjective because the Insta360 ONE R and the GoPro Max, because of their wider bodies, they both do struggle in certain situations, particularly in close-up with the stitching. Let me know in the comments your opinion on the stitching results, and if you've liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.